Thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks, Meryl. Thanks, Charity. Wel gwnes ti chige AI hat do a sock heist han I hat do a sock. Um, Hello. My Tlingit name is Kaa'yis'taan. My jokingly, like my English taxpayer name is Madison. um, and it's a privilege and an honor to be here today, getting to share a little bit about supporting neurodivergence, and talking about colonialism, ableism, and all kinds of things under this little umbrella of care. So whoop, we're going way too far now. We need to go back. Um, yeah, so my name is Madison. I am a behavioral health aide with Tlingit and Haida CBS Healing Center. I use she, they pronouns. I am a Tlingit person, Wishkitan, originally from Sitka, but I grew up here in Juneau. And you might have heard my Tlingit introduction at the beginning. It's a lot shorter because I like to be short and sweet when I can, because I like to talk a lot about a lot of other things. So in our Tlingit introduction, we like to acknowledge our identities, and with that, encourage question. I want to encourage questions to be dropped into the chat as they come up, because again, we only have you for an hour, and I really want to honor that time that you've taken out of your day to spend with us. And so we might end up answering a question, or I might end up answering a question. Throughout this presentation. So if you have one, drop it in the chat. We'll circle back and totally have time for it at the end, if I didn't get to it. There's parts where I'll ask questions too, but keeping that in mind, I'll ask that we kind of keep them to the end, but totally write it as they pop up into your brain. I get it when, if you don't ask it right now, it's going to fly over your head and forget. So let's see, next up. So what are we talking about today? A little bit of everything. So what is neurodivergence? What's neurodiversity? What are some common misconceptions and assumptions? And how does ableism and colonialism connect into this? As well as kind of talk about some updated and inclusive ways to notice, modify, and practice support. I also want to preface that I will be using identity first preference in language. Identity first puts the disability within the identity of the person. So that would be I'm autistic, schizophrenic, blind, ADHD, or person first puts the person before the disability. So person with autism, person with schizophrenia, someone who is blind, person with ADHD. Both are appropriate in the disability justice and advocacy community. But I like to use identity first because much like it isn't a dissectable part of myself that's indigenous, like I can't tell you that it's my right leg that's the quarter Tlingit, it's the whole me that is. My ADHD and autism are a part of what makes me whole, and it's interwoven into who I am. And I don't like to personally identify as though it is separate or something to remove from who I am. And in that vein, my experience is different, and it's not an explanation of a monolith. Neurodivergence is diverse. And so I share through personal experience as well as through professional and observed experience. And a lot of that I'll touch on today. But I want to take note that the best expert of neurodivergence is the neurodivergent person in front of you who's talking to you about themselves. We all are different, and there are things that we can heavily relate in. And so we're going to take that higher level view, but just assume that if I'm sharing something, it's not going to always be true with everybody. And so what is neurodivergence? A wordsy-ish slide, so you're welcome to take a screenshot of it if you'd like to refer back. But it is important to recognize that neurodiversity as a definition is integral to the neurodiversity movement, which had its foundations kind of laid out in about 1993. And that was with Jim Sinclair's speech, Don't Mourn for Us. The word and the definition of it, though, was popularized by a social scientist, Judy Singer. who herself identifies as somewhere probably on the autism spectrum. She used the term in her honors thesis back in 1999. And I feel funny saying back in 1999, but yeah, we're there. And the term was also notably used in 1998 in an article in The Atlantic that was written by Harvey Bloom, who is a journalist advocate. And Bloom wrote about it and initially called it neurological pluralism. Diversity and neurodiversity is usually in reference of a group of individuals. And so here's where it can get a little nuanced, semantic, and confusing, is that if we do want to apply a social model and a collectivist approach, it can be extrapolated that to all of, humankind is neurodiverse, and that is true. We all have our own different ways of processing this information. And I believe that, and this is a pretty big but, we want to be important in recognizing and stating differences, and specifically the ones we're going to talk about today, because without acknowledging and educating, we're going to continue to perpetuate the harm that is stigmatization and segregation, which is where we're currently in. And so providing this caveat that yes, we are diverse as humankind as well. It is incredibly healing to speak up and identify and notice and sometimes label where we need support and equitability and to accommodate. There's also a variety of other disorders that we'll say that fall under neurodivergence, such as FASD and OCD. I'm not going to take a whole lot of time about it today, but they do technically fall under this umbrella of neurodivergence. Those two deserve their own PowerPoint 2-hour presentation in and of themselves. So I do have a question for all of you. What are some assumptions and beliefs or stereotypes that you have as it pertains to ADHD, autism, neurodivergence? And you can unmute or type it in the chat, and we'll take like a minute to see, because I'm always curious. What are we entering with understanding, and what might we not yet have in our belt? Mm-hmm. Yep. I find that a lot of people, and if you don't mind, I'll read aloud, just we can all probably see maybe the chat, but Harmony mentioned, I find that a lot of people who don't have ADHD assume that there's no ability to focus at all. I have ADHD as well. And Juliet says, I always get told, oh, well, you don't seem hyperactive. Okay, we'll touch on that too. Yes. Yeah. Let's see. No empathy. Yeah, no empathy. We'll touch on that one too. And they can't sit still. People of different genders present different neurodiversity. Yes. Yeah, you might notice I'm already fidgeting a little bit. I like to what we call stim. That helps focus a lot of the time. And it presents in different ways as well. When I was evaluating a lot of kiddos for ADHD, I would always disclose I had ADHD for parents so they could see that ADHD doesn't mean they cannot be professionally successful. I love that, and that makes me so excited, because that is a big point, right? Is in stigma we feel, or I think we often see, that neurodivergence is a condemnation, or it's seen as something to be afraid of, to be ashamed of, and to discourage. When so many of us are doing we're active, we're participating, we're advocates, we're professionally successful, however that looks for you. But we're not scary or different. In fact, some of us, like Dr. Fox here, has a PhD. Neurodiverse people sometimes communicate differently than neurotypical people, 100,010%. So here are some common misconceptions and assumptions of ADHD. And we named a lot just now, so that's exciting. I might not go into it a whole lot, but we'll see. I like to talk. The big one is that people, I'll start with, is that people with ADHD are lazy and unmotivated. Absolutely untrue. This is a neurological brain difference. So we do have MRI studies and scans that show that the brains of people that are neurodivergent are very much different. And there's a lot of studies that are coming out recently discussing where we can see that in a variety of ways that are new and exciting as it pertains to different kind of medication options. But the laziness part I want to highlight, in that this is where we start to see some intersectionality between civil rights movement, racial discrimination, and ableism, is that the concept of laziness is rooted in colonization and began its colloquial usage in the 16th century. So when Puritans first came to the United States, and it was used as religious justification to implement the taking of land, slavery, brutality towards Black and Indigenous bodies. So laziness in and of itself, this is a concept I actually don't, and I'm trying to deprogram myself from feeling, because rest isn't lazy, taking space isn't lazy, productivity doesn't mean you're doing better or you're not lazy. It's a really harmful idea. There's also the belief that it's ADHD in particular is an excuse or a disorder that's just seen in people assigned male at birth, so like boys, and it goes away in adulthood. Autism and ADHD, again, they're different neurodivergent traits. They're neurological, biological brain differences. And so these have been around, like in Indigenous speak, we say, since time immemorial. It's been around for a millennia. And they were essential to survival and to caring in community settings. If we think about a lot of neurodivergent brains, we are probably night owls, or we don't have the same kind of sleep-wake patterns. And that would be really helpful, right? If we're in a survival situation where some of us need to be awake during the night so that everybody else is safe. It also is something to note that the first like official medical diagnosis of autism, so neurodivergence, was in 1943 with a man, a cis white man named Donald Triplett. And that was 80 years ago. And he passed away in June of 2023. So this is very, very, very recent that we have started to have this assumptive lens that is not inclusive, right? ADHD also isn't just hyperactive. There are several other kinds that we would talk about. There's inattentive or combined. And most people that are assigned female at birth tend to fall into this inattentive category, or due to societal expectations and pressures, develop an ability to mask really well at a very, very, very young age. And so go undiagnosed for years. The average age of diagnosis for those assigned male at birth is 7. And the average age of those assigned female at birth, I'm curious if anybody might have a guess of it. I'll give like a couple seconds. You can kind of ponder. I will say another thing to note is that 50 to 75% of women or people assigned female at birth who have ADHD do go undiagnosed for their whole life. So the average age, there's good guesses between 13, 14, 20. The average age of diagnosis for people who are assigned female at birth is in their 30s and 60s. So we're talking pretty late, like later in adulthood, because it's not until that point that most people that are assigned female at birth start to have these extreme levels of burnout show up, that the symptoms of depression and anxiety get so bad or so overwhelming that we can't function anymore in that suppressed state. And so that's where we might see that, you know, the symptoms and experiences change over time. And that depends on our kind of neurotype. Are we hyperactive? Are we inattentive? Are we combined? But the brain is the same. It develops, it creates, we have developed prefrontal cortexes eventually. But what makes us who we are, that brain doesn't change, the symptoms do. The exact causes of ADHD and autism aren't completely known, but what we do know is that it is hereditary and it is genetic. It's shown that about 80% of ADHD diagnoses come from observing family members and seeing history, to where several studies have found that it is a definite genetic component to it. Another belief that I think is really harmful and creates a lot of fear in a variety of places is parenting's already scary as is. That's another human we're responsible for, but that there's a belief that bad parenting causes ADHD. And oh my goodness, no way, Jose. No! If there's anything to affirm, if you're a parent, that is not, and a parent of somebody with ADHD, it is not your parenting that has caused that. You probably also have it. But we know it's a neurological difference. And so attentive parenting and support can support a positive identity and formation in kids, right? Same with anything. No two children are ever identical. You get the honor and the privilege to become an expert in who your kid is, and their needs might be different. If you parented 20 kids and then you have another one, the last one's neurodivergent, you probably know from parenting the 20 other kids that each one was a little different. And the most recent one that's neurodivergent will also have its own things that it likes to do. So it's not bad parenting. Another aspect of ADHD that I find in communities where substance abuse and misuse is really prevalent and a concern is that medication, specifically when we're talking stimulant medication, is something that people can be wary of. It's also not a good fit for everybody, so let's talk about that. ADHD medication will change someone's personality. Yes and no. So what it does is it can reduce aggressive behavior and reduce suicidality. And so if like moodiness or aggression increases, that's likely because either the medication type or the dosage amount isn't right for that individual. The specific formula might not sit well or meet those needs of that person. Autistic people, or well, let me back up here. When we think about like suicide, because I touched on this just right now, there was a 2020 research study that was done in Switzerland, and it identified 54,000 autistic folk and then compared them to 271,000 people who aren't autistic. And they found that autistic people are 10 times more likely than the general population to die by suicide. And then for people who are autistic and ADHD without any other, disability going on, 1 in 10 had attempted to die by suicide. And so that's 7 times higher than the comparison group. And those assigned female at birth had the highest rates of attempting to die by suicide and dying by suicide at 1 out of 5. And so when we take medication, specifically with neurodivergent folks, if it is taken orally as prescribed, there is little to no evidence at all in the research and recent studies and literature that medication used to assist ADHD causes addiction or can lead to addiction. In fact, actually, not having medication support can actually lead those with ADHD to start seeking out other substances to self-medicate their ADHD. And that's the behavior that we want to be noticing and probably a little bit more cautious of, because that can start to lead to greater substance abuse and misuse. There are a lot of other ways to accommodate if we don't want to pursue medication-assisted treatment, but part of that is giving that person the empowerment of a diagnosis so they can greater understand their identity and who they are and what they need to thrive. And diagnosis is only, in my belief, an affirmation to give you a greater insight into who you are as a whole. And that is empowering and that is phenomenal. And so when we refuse or we deny somebody the option of pursuing diagnosis, if they're sitting with it, they're feeling this might be a good fit for me, not going with them there can actually be extremely harmful. And it's our job to believe them and to support them in pursuing that, because what's the worst that could happen? You get assessed and that's not it. Great, we can sign that off and figure out how else to best support and what else you might be experiencing. But if we just deny that period point blank, then we deny them the opportunity to get to connect with community. And this is already a lonely enough world as it is. It's worth noting with medication that if it is like crushed up and like snorted or dissolved in water and then injected, that kind of instantaneous speed of release, entering the blood-brain barrier that fast can lead to some, addictive behaviors. We're not meant to have it be that accessible or that quick. But when it's taken orally as prescribed to you by your provider in the dose that is for you, there is no evidence to suggest addiction to the substance. We can have dependency, and stimulant dependency is an addiction. That comes kind of like when you're working out, right? Like if you're lifting weights, you're going to hit a plateau to where now we need to progress up. I want you to now bench like 145 instead of 100 or something. That's a big jump. Don't do that. But you'll need to kind of progressively increase. And there are other ways to accommodate that as well. It might be working on sleep routine or finding other things before increasing. But dependency is being accustomed to the medicine at that dosage, and it isn't addiction in that same capacity. Neurodivergence as a whole has this misconception right now that it's being overdiagnosed, and I want to say big fat on that one. In that approximately 20% of the global population is neurodivergent, and that is taking into account that most of the people actually getting diagnosed are people of affluent means and privileged stances. So cis, white, straight men, affluent, wealthy, white counterparts. BIPOC communities and minoritized individuals are drastically underserved and underrepresented in data. So this 20% is a very low estimate of how many people are neurodiverse. And if we think about left-handedness and how there was a period of time where we saw a really big increase in left-handedness showing up in data, and then suddenly it plateaued because there was no longer this suppression and forced demand to become right-handed. ADHD, autism, neurodivergence is very similar. We're in this little increase because we've suppressed and denied and refused to accept difference for so long that we're going to probably see it keep ticking up. And then we'll have this plateau period where it finds its homeostatic recognition balance place. And then, let's see, with that, suppression of differences is also, again, that little intersectional point of ableism and racism. It's led to a lot of beliefs that are harmful systemically, and we'll touch more later. Also that everybody's a little bit ADHD, a little bit autistic, everyone's a little OCD. Oh gosh. A little harmful in that we all might share traits, right? Like I might have a lot of experiences as a neurodivergent person. And again, I am ADHD autistic, so we'll pretend I'm not. But because I have sensory issues or I like things done in a particular way in order, that doesn't mean necessarily that I am neurodivergent or that I have ADHD or that I'm autistic. It's beautiful. It's humanness. We're all a little different, but there are definite differences in the brain and variations in sensory expressions and thoughts and communication patterns, information processing techniques. And so it's similar, it's a little different. I think in the sphere of what I've observed is that autism tends to get a pretty bad rep. That's harmful. One of the most being that vaccines can cause autism. And I want to go there because this is a neurological brain difference again. And this myth is one that we and the disability justice advocacy and research community have been trying to tear down for years and years and years and years and years and years and years. But it's continued to stick. And so there was a very questionable research paper that had very loose correlations between vaccines and autism. And it was published in a journal in the late 1990s. But the experiment itself was carried out in not only a way that was not up to scientific standards, but it was also done in a fraudulent way, and it was found to be fraudulent as well as non-replicable and not indicative of any such findings whatsoever. And actually, that study's principal physician lost his medical license. And so that idea has spread and it's pervasive and it's harmful medically, not only, in a variety of ways, but also it implies that being different, neurodiversity is something to be feared. It's afraid of, it's bad. And that is just simply not true. It's not something to be afraid of or scared of or worried on. Another one that was touched in the chat was that people that are autistic are cold and have no empathy. Another one that I find to be so untrue, and this in part just comes from communication differences. And so many people that are autistic have a strong sense of empathy for others and even like non-sentient little trinkets and beings. And this comes from understanding what it is to be lonely and to be rejected and misunderstood and dismissed. And so you combine that with a strong sense of justice, great advocate, but high empathy. We might not always get to express it in the way that's communicated to the other person that they understand. So we might show support through giving, physical assurance or jumping to being relatable, like, oh, I know exactly, I've experienced something similar. Or we might just freeze because of experiences we've had where we've tried to share empathy and been misunderstood, and it only made our sense of loneliness and rejection worse. So it can be kind of hard. Absolutely not cold and not lacking in empathy. Extreme empathy. There's a really good video on YouTube by a YouTube channel, Jubilee, that I watched recently and I really liked, which is where they took people that were autistic and people that weren't autistic to talk a lot about these stereotypes. And that video is also almost an hour. So if you have time, I recommend. This isn't a disease. It isn't something that is curable. We kind of touched on that, right? But it's also very similar to how the doctrine of discovery and colonialism led to the belief that white society needed to kill the Indian to save the man. Autism is not an illness to be eradicated. ADHD is not something to be eradicated. It is simply just a part of who a person is, like our eye color, like our skin color, and you can't grow out of it or change that really. And it isn't, in my opinion, an illness or a disorder either. There are neurological differences. Again, I want to stress that. And what can happen, though, is through the misunderstandings, we can have trauma occur and distressing situations happen, or masking for long periods of time that then create great distress. And we then are people that are autistic or ADHDers with depression or with anxiety then because of the impact that society has had on us or just being different in society. Tying into that, learning disabilities or learning difficulties aren't also 100% true. The most recent body of literature and studies show that more than 2/3 of autistic people don't have learning difficulties. It's just a different modality of communication. So often they might have greater reading and writing fluency at a really young age or high pattern recognition, but they might communicate in a way that we don't understand, like gestalt processing, using an AAC device or typing. If you go to Japan and you don't speak Japanese, you don't assume the Japanese person you're trying to communicate with is stupid, I hope. Similar with autism and ADHD and neurodivergency, we just don't know how they communicate sometimes, and we get to figure that out together to best accommodate and support. And so within that accommodation and support, this is a really good book. I want to highlight Notes for Neuro Navigators, the Allies Quick Start Guide to Championing Neurodivergent Brains. And I like this quote in particular because it drives home the big point that connects all of us, which is that you can give people who see the world differently the gift of accepting who and how they are. And that's something we all deserve and are probably have lacked at some point in time. And if we're providers providing a service, we are the people who are there to provide servitude to those who enter our space, who come through our doors. We are there to help meet their needs. And they're trusting us with that vulnerability to support them and accept them. And so we must then do our due diligence to not just be trauma informed, but trauma trained and really keep up with that. And so I'll remind us once today, because I hope we all know it. And if you don't, I want to give you a little something you can take with you to hold your providers accountable with. Let's empower you there. And that is, there are 5 pillars in trauma-informed care. That's empowerment, choice, collaboration, safety, and trustworthiness. And we'll touch on that more in a little bit, and maybe talk about it a little bit more. But that should be what is being provided to every person. And it's so imperative when we're talking about disability advocacy and racial equity and equality. Those become even more imperative through having extreme adverse experience. So with that, super lighthearted transition, our favorite, ableism and colonialism. Again, you can screenshot if you like. This is just a little bite of definitions. I particularly like Talia A. Lewis. They use TA as their pronouns and a genderless identity. So Talia, their website is down at the bottom of that page too. I like their definition of a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, excellence, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, colonialism, and capitalism. Fitting to talk about this for a variety of reasons. One, we're in a field that has stolen so many of its modalities from Indigenous peoples throughout the rest of the world, and then sterilized it and made it into this black and white, you follow these steps, that's what you do, and don't allow space for the nurturing part, which is found in the cultural competency that the modality was taken from. It's also Black History Month today. Happy February. And Indigenous peoples and Black peoples have always shared a great alliance when advocating and demanding for our rights to be equal and to be recognized. The ties between the disability justice and civil rights movement are very strong. The disability justice movement came first. There were members of the disability community that were also Black Panthers. And there was an event where a group of disabled folk were protesting and sat in at the base of the stairs of a federal building that they needed to go to receive their benefits, but they couldn't get in because there were stairs and no elevators. So they sat on the stairs. And that process of sitting in was then able to be taken and moved into the civil rights movement with sit-ins. And Indigenous peoples and Black peoples have always supported each other in that part of the movement. And that's where we get the idea of nothing about us without us, that we must be involved in conversations if we're going to talk about our rights and our care. And so providing care that looks at therapy as a time-bound process to get a person back to efficiency in a productive way is inherently racist and ableist. It's not therapeutic or trauma-informed at all. Providing care that removes the humanness of the provider or the therapist as well is a systemic form of colonialism that, we as providers are in the position of power, and you coming to see us are not allowed to understand who I am, but I have to know who you are. That's a particularly harmful viewpoint to take when we're talking about caring for a diverse population of bodies that have had intergenerational trauma of forced assimilation, um, and culture being removed. Healing is not a path that goes from like, oh, hurt, heal. It's a path of recognition that we have hurt, and then there's humility, and then there's humanity, and then we have hope, and then we have feeling. The hurt in me recognizes the hurt in you. And I'm humble enough to recognize that I am not an expert in your pain or in the right way to do things. I will be the first personally to admit that I don't know everything as much as I would like to. I do not. And none of us are. And particularly when we're in positions of providing care and seen as experts, the pressure to be the person that knows everything goes up, and then our ego goes up, and we forget we're also human. Humility is essential in creating that safety. And then humanity. I also can understand and empathize with your pain. But again, I'm not the person that's proficient in your pain, but I am here to carry it for a little while so you don't have to bear that alone. And that's pretty hopeful. Dr. Fox mentioned something that I think is a huge point of hope, which is that she discloses that she has ADHD when she does her diagnostic testing. And that is such a huge point of hope and advocacy for so many people that don't understand what it is that they're experiencing. And it feels like it can be a condemnation diagnosis when we don't know. But when we see people that inspire us, that are in these positions of care and authority, advocate and say, hey, I have that too. What a relief, what a family relief that is, and an individual relief. And so we have a lot of effects here of ableism and internalized racism, and these are just a couple key points. But when we do not acknowledge our own internalized biases and prejudices and discrimination from being active participants in a capitalist society that is very suppressive and rooted in the suppression of BIPOC and disabled bodies, that means that when we are BIPOC, neurodivergent, minoritized, disabled people going to seek care, we're constantly in a state of exhaustion. Dismissing or not acknowledging how capitalism plays a huge effect on our collective mental health can result in a particularly negative effect on folks who are minoritized. And then why would I go see you if you're not going to even acknowledge the difficulties I'm facing in just existing? My self-care you're advising me to do means go buy a cup of coffee, but I can't even fill my gas tank. We don't need to be advocating a 24/7 as providers. We don't need to be shoving a political agenda, but we do need to acknowledge the adversity of the society we live in and how that's unfairly played out and causes a lot of distress and pain. We have a lot of barriers that also create the denial of equitable access to care. Paperwork assumes that everybody can read, which isn't true, sadly, and because it's such a beautiful form of expression and liberation that everybody has the right and access to. We also assume that everybody can fill out paperwork because they can see. I know of people that are blind that had to fill out paperwork to get the resources they need from the government. But there was no Braille option. There was no electronic document at that time, and they had to fill it out, but they can't see. And so there's an assumption that what we're providing is easy for everybody to access, but it's not. And then increasingly so, we continue to have underdiagnosis of BIPOC individuals. So that continues that lateral harm and violence within already distressed communities by allowing and not educating these misinformations, these stereotypes. If we can do our best to advocate that the reality and the truth and the hope in these diagnoses, they're not seen as shameful. They're not seen as a form of continued suppression, but empowerment and identity. There's also the concept then, and I know some of us might try to say, oh, I don't see, everybody's the same. I don't see color. I don't see disability. And that is a very beautiful sentiment, in that it generally does not mean harm. It can be something I know I've said before where I'm like, I'm at a loss of what to say. But what that also then implies is that there's nothing to change about society, and that your experience and quality of life doesn't mean like if it inconveniences me to change, then it's not worth it, right? So we can see, it's encouraged to see and acknowledge all of the differences and go, yeah, that is heavy, and there's no way to change who you are, but I can change how I do care here, and hope that the little change I create here creates change out there, which does change out there, because I do see, and it is painful. Our systems of care currently in place. If we have the need to put down in our bios or in our websites or in like in statements that we are spaces that are anti-oppressive or decolonizing and anti-colonial, that we're LGBTQIA plus affirming, that we're neurodiversity affirming, that we're BIPOC affirming, that we're disability affirming. If we have to put all those things down, then it's pretty clear that the modalities taught and are widely popular, the systems in effect are created and crafted to cater primarily to the neurotypical, straight, white, thin, able-bodied, non-disabled person. And so that is not an inclusive framework. This is modalities meant to continue suppression and erasure, if we have to put all of those little caveats in there just to say we're safe. We have the obligation, I will say obligation, to not only do our own work and research, but understand that therapy has the potential to obscure rather than to validate the realities of racism and ableism. It's a point of, I do not want to re-traumatize who I'm seeing. So it is on me as a provider to provide the care, the service, to learn and to understand. So my participant, my person in front of me, doesn't have to rehash everything that I've just asked them to redo when they were filling out an AST or they were doing a screening. I can do that work to learn your context. I can learn the context. You might have to tell me about you, but I can do my part in this reciprocal, this relationship of reciprocity, and learn about the context of your pain. And so this next slide is a big long one, obviously, and you can also take a screenshot if you'd like, but it's a lot of different ways to reframe or to start modifying how we support others to accommodate and to validate. We talked a little bit about self-disclosure, and that is a powerful form of accommodation and safety setting. There's a research paper that came out very recently, and I think the title of it's kind of funny, but it's like, nobody knows anything about autism. And it asked people their experiences. And one of the main key factors that came out, that when providers advocate and when they explicitly state their identity, we see the stigmas shift, we see the conversation shift, we see hope increase, simply from disclosing and being in the space of like power that we hold there, which I think is a pretty beautiful opportunity to heal without having to meet with somebody directly, is just to say, I have a shared identity and I see it and I have it and I see you. If you've gotten your screen shot, scoot, scoot. And this is just, I guess, a way to further encapsulate all of that. And I want to share a quote from a book that I really like called Decolonizing Therapy by Dr. Jennifer Mullen. And what we've basically talked about today is the decolonization of therapeutic modalities and therapy and just caring for others by learning and by supporting and by acknowledging. But this quote says that decolonization doesn't mean diversity. It refers to the collective journey towards undoing systemic and individual harm on people, land, cultures, our emotional health, and physical bodies. We're being asked to look at who has taught us, what have they taught us, who has it been approved by, and why. Decolonizing is a process of asking ourselves, whose history is this? How do your words and actions seek to address what has been stolen or lost? And how can we heal that? It's a great book. 10 out of 10 recommend. It's on Audible. If you don't want to read, you can listen to it. But what supports neurodivergent folk supports disabled folk, which supports BIPOC folk, which supports those with a mental health diagnosis, which supports all of us. And so when we create and transform spaces to be truly inclusive, we do a mass amount of healing and support for the many without mass harm to anyone in the process. So personality-wise, like, know that there are different modalities of expressing care. We kind of talked on it, which would be allowing somebody to info dump. That's a form of a neurodivergent love language. There's also pebbling. I saw this coffee cup and it made me think of you, so I got it for you. This rock I found on the beach, the way it was, everything about it, I just wanted to give it to you because I thought of you. That's another one. But I think the ultimate love language that we all want is consideration. And the power of just being considered is inherently healing and providing of care. And can take very little if we just pause for a moment. There's a lot of things we can do personally to help support neurodivergence, which is encourage exercise, daydreaming, be accommodating of needing rest at maybe times that aren't ideal all the time. Workplaces providing different times to come in, maybe a staggered work schedule, mental health days, mandatory mental health days, and not like sick leave that's required. We can modify our modalities, which if you have questions on, I can totally give you a few thoughts on that. But at the core of it is, it's a process and it's okay to be wrong sometimes. And it's okay to admit that you don't know everything. And that in and of itself is extremely healing in a neurodivergent capacity of care, which is taking that consideration, which is taking time to learn and to educate and to practice the intersectionality, because we live in a community and we don't live alone. We're in it to help each other heal. And so that means you don't need to become the most radical social justice warrior in the world. It's pretty draining. And if we're in the system of care, we're already probably tired. It's not a competition or sustainable that way either. We don't need to only in therapy then talk about capitalism or ableism or racism or colonialism. And that may not even come up in sessions or with the people we work with, but doing our work, having that decolonized lens can greatly improve and support a true trauma-informed approach and further support the oath to do no harm and further foster healing as a community. Which, man, if there's any modality I love more, it's healing with others. And so with that, thank you. That's the bulk of this meaty presentation. And I hope we learned a little or got to share a little. If you have any questions, or if there's something that kind of pops up in our brain later as we mull it over, there's my information. You can always reach out to it. And I offer that with the caveat that I also ascribe to the spoons theory, which is that we all have a certain number of like spoons in the day, and different things take a little spoon here or there. And so maybe I don't respond the fastest because I'm in a negative spoon moment. But if I have the spoon, you get the spoon. And so definitely feel free to reach out if you've got questions. Thank you for sharing space and time with me. And with that, yeah, this is like open floor for you, each and every one that's here. Oh, and I'll see if there's